And yes, Yeshua didn't come to abolish the Torah, but we need to make sure that we understand the Torah on its own terms. What does the Torah actually say about that issue? And I think that that's something that we need to ask the question. That's important because that's all very foundational to think about those questions, particularly as you go through the book of Acts and as we follow through in the book of Acts. We're in Acts chapter 13. We've been going through. And, if we think about, I don't know if there was a title for the sermon series we've been going through this year, On Mission. And I think it's important in a Messianic Jewish context to ask the question, we say that we want to, in fact, it's funny, I was talking to a woman who is Greek Orthodox, and she had a Baptist background, and we talked about her journey into Greek Orthodoxy. Of course, I have a Baptist background myself, my journey into Messianic Judaism. And there's been a rise of people coming into Orthodoxy and Christian Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy here in Texas, and in the same way in the Messianic Jewish movement. And what is it? Oftentimes there's the same heart behind what drives people to this, right? Because people want to get into what? Apostolic, right? Something that they want to make sure that what was it like? What was the early church like? What were they doing, and what was the big point of emphasis? So I think it's important. We have to be careful as a restorative movement, because there are other groups that are restorative movements, right? Or they claim to be restorative movements. In other words, that, there was something that was foundational that the apostles and Jesus were a part of, and we've lost that now, so we've got to restore that back to what it was. That's something that Latter-day Saints claim that, right? Jehovah's Witnesses, they claim that. There are other groups that if we measure them up compared to what the scriptures say, we would say that these are heretical groups. Now, I'm not here to bash anybody, but we have to be careful as a Messianic Jewish movement, right? Because that same spirit of taking a factionalism against the traditional church can become a part of our nature and our DNA, and that's a part of what's happened in the Messianic Jewish movement, and it causes division. We have to be careful and on guard of that. And so we go through the book of Acts, and what was the message of the apostles? And what was the practice? What was the things that they were doing? Because that's what we want to be a part of, right? And so if you've got your Bible, turn with me, if you would, to Maaseh Shalachim, the book of Acts, chapter 13. And we're looking at verse 44. We're going to spend just a little bit of time on a few verses at the end here as we go into this. Just want to read over the text and talk about some background. So this is Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, and Barnabas. They've been traveling together. John Mark was with them, and of course at this point he has deserted them, and he's gone back to Jerusalem for something. The text doesn't tell us why that is, but this is Paul's first missionary journey. So if you track through the book of Acts, there are 3 missionary journeys that Paul goes on. And this is the first one, and it starts with him traveling on sail from around Antioch, and he goes to, he goes down to Jaffa, and then he sails out, goes to Cyprus, which is an island in the Mediterranean. It would have been so... one of these days we're going to do it, and from my mouth to God's ears, Beth Yeshua is going to do an Israel tour, and then we're going to do a Pauline tour. Okay, we're going to follow Paul's route, and I think it would be such a beautiful cruise to go to Cyprus and then go to Turkey, and then go into Greece. And so at this particular point in Paul, in this first missionary journey, he kind of makes a circle. You can follow this. And he goes up through southern, what is current day Turkey. And he goes into these particular towns around Ephesus and Iconium, and we're going to read about some of this. He and Barnabas, their mission strategy is to go into the synagogue. Why? Start with the synagogue. It's where Jews are, right? It's where people that understand the Torah. It's where people that have the context. It's where people of the covenant are. And this needs to be the starting point. Now, Yeshua said, go and make Talmudim, disciples of all ethnic groups, all nations. But the best way to do that, he gave that to the apostles, and the best way to do that is to start with the Jewish people, right? Because this is their calling. And we're going to talk about that. We've already talked about it, but we're going to go over that again. In Acts chapter 13, in fact, about this, we'll talk a little bit about this, but this southern area of Turkey in the Roman Empire, this is an area known as Galatia. Everybody like gelato? It's not that, okay. But Galatia, all right, Gauls, which is later becomes known as France, has this province over this particular portion in the eastern area around the Mediterranean, and this is an area known as Galatia. Now it's kind of interesting when you read keep that in your mind as you're going through this and you're reading about some of the challenges that they're facing. This is going to inspire Paul to write these particular churches, these particular congregations, a letter known as Galatians. That's right. That's right. So it's kind of interesting to do a good backdrop study of this when you're reading the book of Galatians. What was the time period? And of course, this is, if you follow the book of Acts, you've got Paul's 3 missionary journeys, this first one to this southern region of Turkey, and then he'll track back to Antioch. And then there's going to be the Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time on that. I want to spend 2, maybe 3 weeks on that because it is absolutely fundamental that we understand that text in the Messianic Jewish context. And then there's 2 more missionary journeys that we see Paul that he takes, and then of course the rest of the book of Acts is about his testimony on trial. But this is interesting that as we read this text today, that this kind of gives you the subset for what later becomes the reason for why Paul needs to write to these people in this area. The next, in verse 44 in Acts chapter 13, the next Shabbat, nearly the whole city came to hear the word of the Lord. Now, if you follow a few weeks back, we know that Paul and Barnabas, I forget the town that they're in here, but you can go back and you can read that. They're in this southern region of Turkey. They go into a synagogue, and Paul is a famous guy. He's been trained by Gamaliel, and everybody knows who he is. But he's also fallen out of grace with his fellow Jewish brethren, many of them because of this message about Yeshua. And Paul himself was against that message. And he stands up and he speaks and he proclaims the good news of Yeshua. And if you read in that text, they were called the synagogue of the freedmen, I believe, or they were called Christianos in this place. Because the outside Greeks recognized that, hey, these people in Antioch, they are followers of this Christos, this Messiah figure. But Paul stands up and he preaches the good news, and this results in a lot of Gentiles being excited. There was something about Paul's message that had an appeal to Gentiles that are associated. And as you look through the book of Acts, we ask this question. Anybody ever ask the question, why are we where we are today? Why are things the way they are today? In fact, if you've come into a Messianic Jewish setting, you've probably struggled with that. Well, things are so different. If it was the Jewish community at that time, and the apostles were Jewish, and Jesus was Jewish, and we see that they're doing this stuff, and things are so different, why is it so different today? And oftentimes the approach is that, well, we have to look to the Council of Nicaea or something of that nature. But I would argue you get to the root of that question by looking, and the beginning root of that is right here developing as we see in the book of Acts. As we see the earliest roots of a potential factionist movement that is starting to develop, or a rift. The next Sabbath, nearly the whole city, so a lot of these Gentiles and Jewish people, by the way, came to hear the word of the Lord. They were excited about this message about Yeshua. Now, keep in mind that in Judaism, it's not totally foreign. The idea that obviously Judaism is the one that recognized and really coined the concept of the Messiah, right? understanding it from the Hebrew Scriptures and the Hebrew text and the prophets. Judaism was not necessarily opposed to the idea of there being a suffering Messiah. Judaism was not opposed to the idea of there being a Messiah who had an ongoing eternal state. Judaism was not necessarily opposed to many of the elements that we see, but there were some things that they were that was unique to Paul's message.